Hello, welcome back to the Fundraising Beyond Borders podcast. I am so excited to have one of my favorite people here, Sophie, who is a grant consultant and founder of Flourish Fundraising. Today, we're going to be talking all about grants, so getting grant ready, where to be finding grants, all the different phases of grants, and also just learning more about Sophie's experience in the international development sector. So Sophie, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you.
Thanks, Morgan. I'm excited to be here too, to have this opportunity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's dive on in. I would first just kind of love to know, and if you could share a little bit more about yourself, and then also how did you get started in grant writing?
Yeah, love to. So I grew up in the UK and I still wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life, as many of us are at 18. But I really wanted to go and work in the, what we call those in the third sector or the, in the development sector. And so I studied an international development studies course at University of Sussex. And that gave me really great broad sort of understanding of the sector, sort of how we got to where the world is today. A lot of really great theory, but not a lot of the practical. So then when I wanted to actually go start working, I met my husband who's South African. So he gave me a really easy way to come work in the sector in South Africa. And that was 14 years ago. So my whole career and everything I've worked for is in the Southern African development sector, and now with a lot more international nonprofits as well. So that's been a lot of my experience and how I got here.
That's great. And, it's not often we find people who say they want to go into the nonprofit or development sector at a young age. So you are definitely one of a kind. So it's great to have someone like you that, kind of knew at an earlier age. And I wish, more people, like when I was going to university, I didn't really know much about the nonprofit sector. So I feel like it's starting to get a little bit better and more awareness, especially around fundraising. But it's great that you kind of had that dream at a younger age. And I would love to know, just share a little bit more. How was that big move from the UK to South Africa, and tell us a little bit more. I think you briefly touched on how long you've been there, where you're living in South Africa, because there's a lot of people tuning in that are international and have moved abroad or are wanting to move abroad. So if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I first came to South Africa 2 years before I, officially moved, and I really fell in love with the country and the people. And I thought when I was back on that plane going back to the UK, I'm going to be back here again one day. So it kind of, the seed was sown then. And previous to that, I'd also done a month in India, which I also really loved. And so I'd sort of had a little bit of the, just experience of living in a, totally different context to where I'd grown up. And I think initially, what really helped was having family already here with, getting married to South Africans. I think that really helped. Whereas I know a lot of people, when you're totally moving to a new place on your own, it can be really daunting and, figuring all that stuff out. I think the hardest thing is always the paperwork and the visas and the learning a new system of how a new country works or doesn't work, maybe, as the case might be in some of the African contexts that we experience. So I think all of that was some of the hardest challenges of just getting used to a new place and a new country. I think I was really, Cape Town is a beautiful and amazing place to live. So I think that sort of was made easier as well. There's a lot of systems in place, a lot of resources that a lot of other developing nations don't necessarily have. So that made it all a lot easier as well. And it's been 14 years this year. So yeah.
It's incredible. It's fun where life takes you. We're very similar in that stage. I don't think we knew that we would be here forever in Africa. I mean, at least for the time being. So it's fun where life takes you, especially when you just decide to make the big leap and see where it goes. So I would love to know, you've been there for 14 years. What type of nonprofits have you worked with? Have they been abroad? Have they mostly been within South Africa? Can you share a little bit more about the nonprofits you have worked with, and then kind of why you started Flourish Fundraising? So kind of that transition into being a grant writer, working for nonprofits, and then transitioning into becoming your own independent company and working with other clients.
Yeah, so for the first 8 years when I was here, we're working for around 4 or 5 over the course of the time, smaller, local, very community-based nonprofits. So I was, every day traveling into the locations and the communities and the townships where the projects were based. So that was really full on and really immersive, and like really understanding the issues, that we were facing as the nonprofit, working with quite a few that saw huge growth in that time. And it was a really exciting space to be in. So I did that for a number of smaller organizations for about the first 6 or 7 years. Then I worked for an organization that was working throughout Africa. So that really gave me sort of a broader understanding. Even though we were based in Cape Town, they were in, 6 African nations. With projects all over. So that gave that kind of international, like how to work with, different entities on the ground and different teams. And so that was a really great experience as well. And then when I had my son, I didn't want to go back to sort of 9 to 5 office work. So I started with very small contracts with some of the previous organizations I'd sort of known and networked with and worked with before. And it basically has just grown. Like it started with really small and kind of doing everything that they needed help with, including, from social media, websites, marketing, redesigning, branding, and then obviously the fundraising side. And over the years, I've sort of honed what services I do offer. And with the birth of Flourish Fundraising, it's really focusing on the grant writing side, because it gives me a lot of flexibility, scope to do remote work, where you don't need to be so involved with, with the projects on the ground. And it's just provided me with that space to be able to support more than just one organization at a time, which is what I really love about consulting. Where often the nonprofits I work with, they wouldn't be able to afford another whole full-time fundraiser. They can use my services, and it just takes that whole section of fundraising, which is usually grant writing, off their plates, and they can say, okay, somebody else is, outsourcing it. So that's what I also really love about being able to work with a number of different organizations at one time. So yeah.
Thanks for sharing. And so Sophie and I, to give more context, our journey started together almost 8 years ago, which is really fun. So when I first landed out in Livingstone, Zambia, Sophie and I were working for the same nonprofit. And I then moved to Cape Town, and we got to collaborate there. And then we've really been able to stay in touch and support each other along the way. And really, really honored. Sophie is a grant writer to many of our clients for Fundraising Beyond Borders. So she has some really great expertise. And like Sophie's been sharing, she has that unique advantage of working with a lot of South African nonprofits, but also working with a lot of international. So a lot of our joint initiatives, we have clients in the UK, we have clients in Guatemala, we have clients in Canada, so around Europe. So really from all around the world, which is great, but it has its challenges. So I would love to know, Sophie, from your perspective as a grant writer, what unique challenges do you face when working with international nonprofits compared to local ones? And I think it's good to kind of pull those out, because there's going to be a lot of people listening in, understanding where you're coming from and talking through those challenges, and then maybe how we can break through those barriers a bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of the main things comes down to so often it comes down to communication. And so with some of these that are based in the US or Canada, we have to really work on different time zones. So we're now doing meetings in the evenings and trying to sort of coordinate between different time zones, which is always interesting. And then even working now in new languages, we're working with the community in Guatemala. And although obviously there's a lot of languages here where we work in Africa, but it's just a whole another new set of challenges to be translating from Spanish to English and back again. So that's a really interesting. So much around the communication with that working. And I think any new team, whether they're local or international, is trying to figure out a really great system of how to work. How do they work? How do they best communicate? And every person is unique and every team works differently. So trying to figure out, okay, this team actually loves WhatsApping, so we'll just send WhatsApps and that will be our, the best way to communicate. Whereas others, it's like, we want everything on email, everything needs to go on the Trello board or the Excel. And so I think with any team, it's figuring out how you work best with their team. And, some teams need a lot more hand holding. A lot of the ones we're working with now are new to grants, new to grant writing. So we're really starting from, right from the beginning, of even figuring out, okay, how are we ready, for grants? I think we'll get into that a bit later. But, so I think there's challenges that then come with, having an international registration where a lot of us have a US based entity or Canadian based entity or UK based entity, and then or sometimes not having local registrations. And so figuring out, okay, what grants can we apply for? What do we need, to be working on the ground, as opposed to they've got a lot of stuff and the governance figured out in the US or overseas, but the local registrations need to be looked at. So there's those kind of different challenges that come, and then always working in different budgets. So now we've got to figure out, okay, we're talking about US dollars here, Canadian dollars, local Zambian kwacha, it's all like figuring out that kind of global, those kind of challenges, I think, are the main ones we face.
Absolutely. And I think what you're sharing is very transferable to whether you're in grant writing, whether you're running an organization, M&E collecting, whatever it is what it comes down to is organization. So having some sort of key organization, project management. Our team uses Trello a lot for our project management. So having, whether that's Trello or having a really good Excel system or Google Workspace, whatever it is, and taking time to invest in that organization prior to jumping into something big really helps. So, taking a month into getting to know how teams work and making sure all your documents are organized and in one place. And I know, like you're saying, we'll get into that in a second, but I think that's a really big key learning lesson, is having some sort of project management built into your organization, especially for international nonprofits, because there's so much going on, and making sure you're keeping in mind currencies and different time zones and different languages, all that you're sharing. So that's, I think, really important to consider. Cool. So as we look into, international nonprofits and grant writing, and just, I guess, looking for different grants out there, what type of, are you seeing different emerging trends or observing different opportunities when it comes to international grants? So, and I don't know if you want to speak specifically, you can speak definitely specifically to South Africa, because I know we have a lot of people tuning in from South Africa, but then also internationally, do you see any trends? And that can be trends of where you're actually doing the grant prospect searching. So are there any online databases, or are there any trends when it comes to having like different types of projects that funders are really interested in? So if you want to share a little bit more about that would be great.
Okay, perfect. So I think if we just look at South Africa, because again, that's where the majority of my experiences and my current clients is that there's a lot of shift and movement to looking at scale. So funders are either already got a lot of their grantees in place, and it's sort of an annual rolling. They, not looking for new ones, and it's very difficult to get in there. But if you are working to looking at scale, how are you wanting to expand your programs? There's so much scope for that, because funders are wanting to see numbers. They want to see impact on that kind of level. And then on the other side, I mean, with all international, wherever, impact is the biggest the buzzword that's been going around for a number of years. But if you're not measuring the impact, it's, we can't just be measuring number of workshops or number of initiatives that we're doing. It's like, what is the change that happens after that? What are we seeing long term? What is the goal? What is the vision? And if you aren't able to measure that, then it's very difficult, especially in the grant space. I think with campaigns, individual donors, there can tend to be less on the reporting side, less on the M&E side. I mean, obviously there's a lot that we want to share, but it's so often it's about the stories. And that does come into the grant space. And the more we can bring that in, it really brings across the personal side of what we're doing and the impact. But if we don't have the numbers to back that up, if we don't have the figures, if we can't show this is the impact our program is going to have or is having, then it's going to be really hard to compete. And that's what it is at the end of the day. We are competing for grants with similar organizations that are doing similar work. So I think there's a real push for that again, which, it just because there's so much competition in some ways for grants, because there are so the need is so great out there. And so I think that's a big push in that space. And then with international, I'm seeing a lot more and a really exciting shift, especially on the US side, to be supporting and funding locally run, locally based organizations. So there's a big shift in, with USAID and with these big international funds, where they realizing that even if they say they're funding local projects, it's still going through their head offices in New York or wherever outside of the countries they're working in. So there's a really big shift towards that, which means we also then need to have great organizations that are really well run on the ground in these countries they're working in. So then we also need to have the local legislation, the local policies in place, the really good accounting systems and finance. And if those aren't in place locally as well, then it's also going to hinder being able to apply for grants, because the amount of just paperwork and due diligence that's required for any kind of grant application, big or small. I think they, even when I started 14 years ago, we could sort of just write a nice sort of proposal and just send it off, and maybe a little bit of money would come in. But these days, the amount of documents we need to send, you need to have the stuff in place, and that's for international and for local grant making, in general. So there's many databases out there, locally, and then internationally there is a lot of places to go, and it's just doing the research. AI does help these days when just finding just in general, where can I be looking. There's a lot of platforms and a whole list that we could share. But Grant Insider, there's Candid, there's lots for the US and Canadian based ones, and then locally there's many different directories. But I think the trouble with all of these is that they do go out of date, so they do end up with, the person that was the head of CSI change, and you need to be keeping those. So we can't always rely on these, the websites or the databases that we have. You need to be doing your primary research yourself. You need to be making the phone calls. You need to be trying to make that initial relationship starting before sending off the grant. So that requires time, requires just doing that kind of digging kind of research. So that's the same for any grant you're applying for. Yeah.
And I think too that one thing that we've seen with international nonprofits is one great place to start. So if you are an international nonprofit working abroad and you don't know where to start, one great place is the local embassies. So with our grants in South Africa, with even in Guatemala, the first place that we're looking into is different embassies. So, we've worked with the Japanese embassies, the American embassies, whatever local embassies are in your area. That's a really good place to start off with when it comes to seeing if you can apply for any of their funding.
Yeah, 100%. And what's really nice about the embassies is they always have a call for proposals, so you know exactly when to apply, what they're specifically looking for. Do you fit in with the criteria? Do you have the paperwork in place? There's so many funds out there where you don't have a lot of that kind of information, or they're open all year, so it's very difficult to sort of plan that in well. So yeah, the embassies are, and they're in every single country and from every single other country in the world. So yeah, they're a really great resource and a great place to start. Just have a look, you know, and building that relationship as well, because they're really about the local communities. So yeah, that's a really great place to start.
Yeah, and I think we're talking a lot about, and we're kind of transitioning now into what's my favorite part about grants is like there are multiple phases of making sure you're even grant ready, all the way to then getting a grant and what do you do next. So we're gonna kind of walk through those different phases, but Sophie and I have worked with dozens of organizations of all different sizes, sizes of a couple $100,000 to multi-million-dollar. And, oftentimes even the ones that have $1 million organizations, they don't have those basics in place to make sure you feel really great to get started with grant writing. So I thought we could take the time to kind of go through those phases. And the first phase is such a key phase because when you don't have foundations in place, it's hard to, kind of move forward and making sure you're putting through quality information, or you're just kind of going in circles with team members of collecting information from all different angles and areas. So let's talk about that first phase, which is getting grant ready. So what are some of those key steps in order to get grant ready, and especially for an international nonprofit, like keeping in mind, you're getting your project management up to date, your currencies, your flow of working with people. So if you could walk us through that first phase, that'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. So I almost think of it whenever I start with a new organization, or when anyone's thinking about, okay, we want to apply for grants, where do we start? It's almost doing a like feasibility study of like, okay, what is in place and what do we need to work on to be grant ready? So I think the first thing, because it's always asked in a grant for whatever size, whoever you're applying to, they'll ask for your vision, your mission, your goals, your objectives as an organization. And even looking at those, sometimes some organizations have used the same ones for, 30, 40 years. And when somebody outside comes and reads it and says, actually, it's not that clear, actually that vision is actually more of a mission. So even just getting those like basics in place. And sometimes that does require doing, a whole sort of new strategy or new plan around that? Or is this actually still our vision? Is this still what we are doing when we started 20 years ago? Has that changed? So I think even just getting those really clear, and even within that, can every person in your organization state those, at least your vision, at least your mission? So just making sure those things are throughout the organization as well, because so often funders will come and visit, or they'll come and chat to, other staff members. That's always a good sort of place to start as well. And then from that, we'll then look at the budget. So do you have organizational budgets in place? Do you have your project budgets in place? So, and how do they look? Some can be very basic, which is fine, but sometimes we need to work on those. So how your budget's looking in terms of your financial services. Do you have the trained and qualified people in your staff, or outsourcing? What kind of policies do you have in place in terms of finances? Because we're asked all the time these days, do you have a risk management policy? Are your finances audited? And that's, a big step in the right direction for grants, even if it's not legislated in your country. I know in some, even in Canada, America, like it's not under a certain amount. It's not, you don't have to have it in place. It's a good thing to have in place. So maybe put it in your budget for next year, that you work towards getting audited financials, because it just shows another level of accountability towards the funders. Then we can look at your governance in terms of your board of directors. Do you have specific roles and responsibilities? Are they written down? Do they know what their roles are in terms of, fundraising as well? But do you have a good diversity on your board? Is that something that It is needed to be looked at as well, in terms of putting a strategic plan in place with your board and wanting to bring in new people, different people, younger people, those sort of things with your board. And then, other kind of policies. Do you have your HR policies in place? What are you looking at in terms of your employment equity? Those sort of things are always asked these days. And then the kind of real documentation that needs to be in place. In South Africa, we've got a lot of documentation in terms of registrations that are needed. There's a lot around our EEE legislation, but even in other countries, what is your local registrations that you need in place? Is it, you need your tax certificates, your local NGO registration, your international registrations, all of those things, just have them in one place. And if you don't, how are you going to work towards getting those? And then any kind of marketing, communication, because that's such a big part of the fundraising. You're often asked to upload your annual report as well. They'll ask for your social media presence. These days, you have to list all of that in a grant application. So where's that at in terms of you have nice pitch decks to use? So your kind of marketing that really fits in. And then looking specifically at the project that we're applying for, is it a project that is actually fundable? Does it have the right things in place that we would need to see? Do you have a theory of change? Do you have log frames? Do you know what you're going to be measuring? Like all of those things that are involved in a sort of setting up a project that could be grant ready. And so all of those things need to be looked at sort of before you even think, okay, let's start doing some grants. And the really nice thing about this is once you have got all those things in place annually, it's just updating it. Now I've worked with a lot of organizations for 5 years, 6 years, and every year is actually almost just copying and pasting, updating, editing, getting the new certificate for the year. But once you have a lot of this in place, we call it a blueprint, so you've got this blueprint ready that just needs updating. The budget needs updating for the year. So don't think of it as like, oh, we've got to do this every 6 months. It's like once you've got these things in place, obviously your projects change, but a lot of those sort of fundamentals don't really change from year to year. So get them in place as soon as possible, and then it just makes everything easier long term.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that, oftentimes we have to go backwards and like have organizations pause for a second. But once you invest in getting all these foundations in place, it drastically helps with getting grants out faster and more efficiently too, and better utilizing everybody's and the team's time. So we talked a lot about getting grant ready, and I'll definitely link, we can kind of put in our show notes together just kind of what that grant readiness checklist looks like, and I'll link it so Sophie can share more about that. But so we talked a little bit about M&E, and we talked about what's needed. I guess now it's okay, so we have all these things in place. The second phase is applying. Do you have any just quick tips and tricks when it comes to applying to grants? And I know, every grant is going to be very different, whether it's an embassy grant, whether it's a grant that, funds maybe $5,000, or you're looking at, $1 million. There's going to be different things, but are there kind of like fun tips and tricks that you can look into when it comes to applying to make it more successful?
Yeah, so I think one of the main things to remember is like, even though you might be using an online form or, sending an email to somebody, without a name, it's just an email address, you're still speaking to somebody at the end of the day. There's still a person going to be reading that application at the end of the day. So keep that in mind, that you're still speaking to people, and not necessarily sometimes people that don't know much about your project, sometimes people that do. So just really, really all the time you're writing the grant or thinking about the grant is, who am I speaking to? Is it somebody that knows us? Is it somebody that doesn't know us? Do they understand our context? Do they not? A lot of, especially when you look at the corporate social investment funders or ones that sort of know the area they're speaking to, they will, they know so much about the context. You don't have to, go so much into the problem statement, because they're like, we're the experts as well. We know it, so just really have in mind who you're speaking to, and to be in any way building up that relationship before you even, do the application. Is there a phone call you can have? Is there, some way that you can ask them to come visit before you do your grant? We're thinking about applying, and a lot of the times it might be they might come visit after you've done the application. It's always sort of different per funder, but any kind of relationship you can build with that person at the end of the day that does the decision making is going to be in your favor. And I think being really strategic around who you apply to, because grants take a lot of time. So if you are looking at a number of grants and you're like, we can just apply for them all, and you don't realize how much time they do take, even though you can be so prepared, because every single one's got a different format. They ask for something in slightly different ways. So having as much of that pre-work done does really help. But to be really strategic about which ones you apply for, do we really fit in with this focus? If not, then we've got to make a decision here about whether we apply or not. And then just, I think a bit, main thing is really follow the instructions. I mean, a lot of the grants these days are really clear: 150 words, 150 characters, and they're very specific in terms of what the word count is, or how you must upload it, and so sounds really basic, but like, follow the instructions. If they ask you to upload a one-pager, only upload a one-pager. Don't try and squeeze in more information. And I think another key thing I've realized these days is about being succinct. Can't say that word right. Funders are reading pages and pages and pages of proposals, and so the more succinct you can be, often on the ones where they don't have word counts, the more clearer you can be, the more you can get across in fewer words, is always going to be like move to the top of the pile. I think for a lot of, when I hear about people who do the other side of sitting and reading these reams of applications and proposals, and I think that's a really good way to aim for having real clarity about what you do and how you do it, and then to be able to share it in a succinct way. I think is a good things I'm seeing.
Those are such good tips, really good tips. Number 2 really stands out to me as well, because we talk a lot with Fundraising Beyond Borders of making sure you're investing in strategies and fundraising activities where you're going to see a return on your investment. So don't just apply for any type of grant that you can maybe get your hands on. Make sure that you're being strategic in what you're applying for. I do this often when it comes to, working with owners or grants, is like putting together a little scorecard. So ranking your grants in order of like, what is the probability of actually getting this grant, and maybe focusing on the top 3 and then moving your way down from there. So I really like that tip. Okay, so we have the last phase, and this is the exciting phase because yay, you got the grant. Everybody's celebrating. Now what? What happens once you receive the grant? What is important to make sure that, that funder might come back next year, or continuing to have a good relationship with that funder?
Yeah, so I think this then moves into the grant management phase. So now you are managing someone else's money that they've given you. So it's really important to have any kind of agreement in place. So most will then come back with, okay, here's the agreement. This is when we're going to pay you. This is what, the terms of our contract now that we have, and really scrutinize and make sure that you have got all of that written down for yourself, and you take note of the reporting dates. Every single funder will have different levels of reporting, different time of reporting. Some will need 6 months report, some will need quarterly report, some will just need annual report. Some will say, don't worry, just send us your annual report. Those are always the nicest ones. But there's going to be definitely the kind of reporting. And then if you don't know, if they haven't sent you a template, or they haven't made it really clear, like what is required within that reporting, then ask the questions, send a template and say, is this, will this be okay for the kind of report that you need? And try and get to know your funder as much as possible, to know, like, what do they really love? Some funders love photos and stories, that's what they, want to be able to share with everyone. And others are like, send me all the numbers, I want to know specific numbers of every kind of, number that you can give us. So I think, having all of that in mind, because so often you'll have more than one grant funder. So as much as you can, getting all of that reporting in place and the systems for that in place before then you come to do the reports, and it's not scrabbling around trying to find that information. It's like, okay, in 6 months, this is what we're going to need to find. So how do we have that system in place? So that when we need to report, it's just drawing from all the different sources. The program managers know what they need to be reporting on, the different members of staff who are involved, and then you just as the grant manager sort of are able to pull it together. And again, just understanding who your donor is. Do they want to get your newsletters? Do they want to get regular feedback outside of their sort of formal reporting structures? Others say, please don't send anything, they don't want to hear from you and they're happy with that. So I think it's really about getting to know the donors and like, what do they want to see? What do they not want to see? And really respecting that, don't send them stuff if they said, please don't add us to your mailing list, just send them your mailers, like, really get to know them. And I think, and then just be really diligent with your reporting and keeping in touch with them. And again, remember, they're people at the end of the day. So remembering their birthdays and sending them Christmas cards and, those things that we like to do with our individual donors, they also, are, we're building relationships as well at the end of the day. So the more you can get to know those grant managers, the better. So I think those are some key points with the grant management. And the finance side, is a really obviously the big point of the grant management is like, what was the money paid for? How are we going to spend it? How are we going to report on it? So that's a big part of the grant management.
It really is. And I feel like that's a big step that people either leave behind or don't focus on. And, it's the same, just like individual donors is, we worked so hard to get them in the door. Let's keep them there. So making sure you have someone on your team dedicated to supporting, those updates and engaging them and building relationships, I think is so crucial. So making sure you have somebody on the team that can help with that. As our time kind of comes to a close, Sophie, is there any type of essential skills or qualities that you kind of pull out or notice when it comes to grant writing? So if somebody's saying, I really want to become a grant writer, or I think, I can take on grant writing for nonprofits, for my nonprofit, is there like a specific skill or quality that they should have? Or maybe is there a certain type of training that they should have when it comes to upskilling themselves in grant writing?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of more, professionalization in the grant writing space. So there is courses you can do, the certificates you can do. I think a lot of it can come from experience though, because until you've actually done some grants, it's very different learning the theory to like, okay, how do we actually do this? And under pressure, doing it often under time pressure. So it can, that's a very different sort of skill. So time management is like, I think one of the biggest skills, which I guess is the same for most occupations, but being able to juggle and manage a lot of different activities that are happening at the same time with different teams. Even if you are working in an organization as the fundraiser or as the grant writer, there's still a lot of the sort of pulling of the strings and making sure you're pulling everything together. And I think a lot of people, or you can get into grant writing because you enjoy the writing side of things, and that is a huge part of it, taking all this information and honing it into 150 words and being able to really show the impact that you're having. It is a skill. But then there's so much else involved with grant writing. You've got to be able to understand budgeting and how does the finance work and how do we make our budget fit into with the, the budget that they are giving us, and how do we make that fit with all our other budgets and our overheads. And so there's a lot in terms of the budgeting as well. So I think having a range of those sort of skills, a lot of it's project management, because you need to speak to the project team about the project information, and then your accountant about the finances, and then it's the MD who's reading over it and signing off on it. So I think even just being able to project manage is a huge part of the grant writing space. And I think all of those things sort of combined together create quite a really unique and interesting job. I love what I do. I love being able to tell people, because especially outside of the US, it's not a huge, even job that people even think of, as a potential occupation. So I think there's so much potential out there. I mean, we have almost 300,000 nonprofits in this country, and each one of them, the main thing they have to be having is funds and funding. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for it to become much more professional and, much more of a potential occupation for people. So yeah, to be getting into the sector, it's a really exciting way. So yeah, so that's what I think. Grant writing can bring out a lot of those different things, and especially if you work as a team and you have somebody that is better at the budgeting and somebody that is better at the writing, then you work as a really good team together. So yeah.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing everything, Sophie. One last question, just as a fun parting thought. What is one of your favorite things about living in Cape Town? Or maybe sharing what is one of your favorite activities to do in Cape Town? Because let me tell you, I did have the chance to live in Cape Town, and it is one of my favorite places, especially to go back and visit, because between the winelands, the city, the beach, just you name it, there's so much to do. But what is one of your favorite things to do?
I think for me, one of my favorite things is the wining and dining scene, because there's some most amazing, we've got some of the most amazing restaurants that are like the best in the world, but without the kind of international prices. So I think that's one of my favorite things. And like you said, being in the winelands, I think every place I've lived in, about 6 different places, and each one we've been about 10 minutes away from the nearest vineyard. And I think that's really unique. There's not many places that are wine growing in the world. But I think what I love also most about Cape Town is the diversity. So like you said, we live on a farm now, so we're in that kind of farm life. We go hiking and it's hills, but then just down the road is the beach, and the most beautiful beaches. And then on the other side of the hill is, wine farms that you could just go visit. So I think the uniqueness of the Cape as well is really special, that you can decide today we're going hiking, or tomorrow we're going to go sit on the beach. So I think that's what I really love about it, the diversity of, what do you want to do? And the weather.
I agree. And the weather is great compared to the UK. Sorry for those living in the UK. Don't know if I could do the rainy seasons all the time, but the weather is great in Cape Town. And if you ever have a chance to visit, you must let us know. We'd love to give some recommendations of our favorite places, because it's amazing. There's endless things to do. Well, Sophie, thank you so much for being on. What is the best way for the audience to connect with you? Where can they find you online?
Yeah, LinkedIn is my go-to place at the moment. So you can find me on there, or drop me an email, sophie@flourishfundraising.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sophie. And if you all have any questions, we'll be linking some things in the call notes, some next steps. But we will all be in touch. And thank you for tuning in again.
Thanks, Morgan.